my name is Julia Schaeper. I'm a designer and researcher in the field of regenerative design, design for degrowth, as well as social and service innovation. I'm also very close to submitting my PhD thesis at UAL. And in my research, I'm exploring organizational design for regenerative economy, and specifically what it takes for an organization to work in more sustainable ways by design. So I've got quite a long-standing background in service design. More than 15 years ago now, I started to work with a service design agency called Engine before moving on to being an in-house service design lead in the NHS, working within social innovation, but really focusing on building internal capacity for change. I then expanded to the field of healthcare innovation and really focusing on improving patient experiences and moving into systemic design, working with redesigning the more organizational structures, working with LiveWork and Adidas. And this year in particular, I've been focusing on regenerative design and leadership, working with Unternehmertum in Germany and also Techem, some energy-based companies in Germany this year. So this morning, I'd like to share mainly some of my PhD research with you, which is still work in progress, as I said, so please bear with me. So while I might not have all the answers, my aim with my research is to contribute to a possible pathway forward that can inspire new design approaches. So today's talk is divided into 3 parts. First, we'll touch on the pressing issue of our planet that's facing multiple crises and the case for change. The next, we go on to explore the imperative to redesign design. And finally, I provide quite a condensed overview of my research on the commons as a potential framework for relational design in the future. So I'd like to start off with some context. I think we all know that in order to preserve a livable planet for the future, we'll need to successfully navigate the transformation to a sustainable and climate neutral world. At the moment, we are headed for 3.2 degrees of global warming within the lifetimes of present generations. And actually, us as humans, we've never lived on such a planet. And scientists already warn of severe displacements, crop yield decline, and political upheaval. We are already in the midst of the 6th mass extinction, and just in the past 3 decades, we've lost 75% of our biomass. The world has already lost 1/3 of its forests, and we've used so much fertilizer in our agriculture and practice monoculture large-scale farming that our soils are eroding. And soil depletion is a serious problem as it eradicates critical nutrients that we all need to survive. And many scientists believe that we only have 60 harvests left. Now, I think that's quite concerning. And when we look at our marine life, in 2050, it said that we will have more plastic floating around than ocean species. And climate change isn't, of course, the only crisis that we face. We're also overshooting other planetary boundaries, including a staggering collapse of biodiversity. So let's have a quick look at where we're at collectively. This is a recent update from the Stockholm Resilience Center, which summarizes an overview of the planetary boundaries. Now, planetary boundaries are a concept introduced by a group of Earth scientists to define the safe operating space for humanity within the planet's ecological system. And that's what you can see on the slide in the center. That's the green part. And these boundaries represent critical limits that, when crossed, could result in abrupt and irreversible environmental change, which can, of course, pose significant risk to human well-being and global stability. Now, there are nine planetary boundaries, each representing a different aspects of the Earth environment. And as you can see in this recent update, I think it was only a bit less than a month ago, we've actually already crossed 6 out of the 9 boundaries. And then climate change and some of these planetary boundaries are just one facet of a much deeper planetary challenge that's entangled in multiple crises. So recent events, including conflicts and wars, I think have further intensified this polycrisis and made it really unprecedented in its scale. To tackle these complexities, we know that we need new approaches for transitioning existing systems from being dysfunctional to being regenerative, and it involves reimagining our material economy based on potentially some leased assets, different governance frameworks, and ways that allow us to pretty much redefine every relationship we have between us and nature, between us and organizations, and between us and our governments as well. Now, I'm hopeful that design can have a role in this context, as it provides participatory processes and agency to effectuate change. But in order to do that, we would need to consider just how we can transition towards a more regenerative system by design. So before I move on to the next part, I'd like to invite you to just reflect on the following question on the screen here and just share your thoughts in the Zoom chat, and Jonas and Kala will be collecting your comments. So take a moment to reflect on how you feel in the middle of all these global crises, this polycrisis coming together. And I'd be really curious to hear or to see some comments around whether already this is influencing your current design practice. So we just maybe give you a minute or two to gather your thoughts and share them with us in the chat. Right, I can see some comments in and I'm reading them as well. Polycrisis, a scary term. Indeed. Please keep on sharing your comments. We get back to them towards the end. Okay, but now moving on to the second part. The need to redesign design. Just need to, I've got a tiny little screen. I just need to rearrange my windows a little. Okay, now. Okay, let's begin by examining what scientists often identify as the root cause of our current crises, which is the great acceleration. You can see a graph on your screen. So this term describes the continuous and substantial growth in a wide range of human activity. So since the 1950s, pretty much everything from the use of fertilizers, paper production, tourism, transportation, CO2 emissions, you can see it on the screen, has been accelerating at a very, very steep increase. And some argue that this acceleration was, of course, deliberate by design. And I personally don't think it's due to ignorance or individual behavior or perhaps a lack of concern that we find ourselves in the situation. But empirical studies reveal that it is simply due to the design of our economy. And by that, I don't mean markets and trades and businesses, because these existed for thousands of years and they're indifferent enough on their own. But what I mean is the very structural features of our economies, and that these are entirely organized, designed, and dependent on the very idea of perpetual growth, as shown in the great acceleration graph as well. Everything is growing exponentially. And it's not really an ideological issue on its own either. It's quite functional as well. If our economic system doesn't grow, it spirals back into crises with devastating consequences, particularly for the poor and less privileged. And the thing about our economic system is that the purpose of increasing production is in fact not primarily to improve people's lives or to achieve specific social goals, but to continuously extract and accumulate profits. And this, of course, has led and still leads to an extreme wealth. So whilst the richest 12% of adults in the world own about 85% of global household wealth, so this is the blue and the dark green on the screen here, the bottom half, which is the light green, collectively own 1% of global wealth. And the result is that we then have an economy that's massively overusing resources and energy, and yet remarkably still fails to meet basic human needs. For instance, despite this immense production and appropriation in the US, which is the richest country in the world, a quarter of all people still live in substandard housing and half of them cannot afford any healthcare. And I think this maybe also shows that as much as we would like to keep the idea of sustainability potentially unpolitical, it's really difficult and not often possible because our material and resource extraction is so inextricably linked to the way that we organize and design our economies, including the way we've come to extract raw materials from abroad and recently very often from the global south. So scientists are now clear that it's the rich economies of the global north that are overwhelmingly responsible for our ecological crises, and that this mindset of extraction and growth is not only a cause of many of our sustainability problems, but also issues around climate injustice and economic inequality. So you might then ask, well, what does all of that economic background have to do with design? Well, service designers, like many of us, I think, in the room, are dedicated to crafting innovative value propositions and business models that bring about positive change and meet people's needs. And design generally has been acknowledged for its contribution to innovative business strategies, the creation of products and services and experiences that all drive further market commodification and increase sale. And in doing so, I would argue that design actively influences and perpetuates the very dynamics of our economic system. No, it's not moving forward now. So to understand the impact of design, let's just have a look at Apple as an example. So I think all of us know that Apple's success is often attributed to its very strong design philosophy embodied by visionary figures like Steve Jobs or Jonathan Ives, who seamlessly blended technology with aesthetics and established a brand that's known for its unparalleled consumer loyalty. And Apple's success is often attributed to its very strong philosophy. That said, the phrase designed by Apple in California proudly accompanies their products and symbolizes this design legacy, right? However, beneath this narrative often lies a less discussed but equally vital phase, which is assembled in China. And I think the distinction between locations of design and assembly reveals quite a crucial insight when viewed through the lens of neoliberalism, and which is why I would argue that design cannot be really separated from it. It hints at a global division of labor where manufacturing processes have migrated to regions with abundant and low-cost labor, while the higher value tasks such as design and designing remain in affluent developed nations. So Apple's primary focus is on design, while the assembly process is outsourced to a separate entity, which is responsible for assembling electronics and often under really challenging conditions. And analysis of those global supply chain relationships highlight that most profits are, of course, also generated as value added in importing countries, where the products are ultimately sold and consumed. So where design is actually positioned. So in the case of Apple computers, design therefore assumes the role of the primary value producing activities, while labor faces exploitation and devaluation in the context of export-driven production. Now, the key point, I think, to illustrate with this example is the deep entwinement of design within the value chains of capitalism, which I think as designers we can no longer ignore, and which in my view calls for reconsideration of design and looking at what design's impact is in the broader context. Now, of course, there are arguments about green growth and that it's not so bad. All we need to do is focus on green growth. So let's quickly move on to that topic for a moment and look at it. So green growth is about the idea that in order to reach sustainability, ultimately we can remain in the same system that we're in. And all we need to do is to focus on efficiency improvements, become perhaps a little bit greener in our current activities, which would then allow capital to continue increase production and profits, while at the same time reducing ecological impact. So going by that, we wouldn't have to change anything in the way we design or the ways that design feeds into the neoliberal processes. Or then there's the idea that all we need to do is to decouple GDP from emissions. So the main argument being that if we decouple GDP growth from the resource use, in other words, dematerialize our economy, we'd be fine as well. And we'd absolutely know that it's possible to decouple GDP from emissions, and that it happens by shifting to cleaner energies, as some nations have already or are already on that path, and Denmark and Sweden and the UK are some who've actually proven that it does work. But I think what we're facing here is a question of speed and the fact that we simply cannot decouple GDP from emissions fast enough. So we're simply running out of time, and scientists are quite clear that the path to absolute decoupling, which is what we would need, and clean energy is actually going to be really dirty, and that we will need an awful lot of raw materials that for now are deep inside Earth still. In order to get them, in the case of lithium alone for battery use, it's actually predicted that we will need to increase current extraction rates by more than 2,700%. So then let's look at some examples that might be interesting for us as service designers, which actually aim to dematerialize our economy. So for instance, Zipcar or H&M's pre-loved circular clothing services, because I think these are two examples that illustrate both the potential and the challenges of transitioning to more sustainable practices through design. So while the pre-loved circular clothing service extends the life cycles of clothing and promotes sustainability, no doubt, which is great, they don't really address the issue of overconsumption in the fashion industry. In other words, the root cause, which still remains our utter challenge. And then let's move to the left, which is Zipcar. So Zipcar's goal of reducing private car ownership very much, I think, aligns with green growth's principles. But actually, research has shown that its actual impact on emissions is also really complex, primarily due to something called the rebound effect. So when the convenience of car sharing actually leads to more frequent and shorter trips, that can diminish the emission savings and increase non-transport related consumption because you end up spending it somewhere else. So I think that's quite interesting to remember for us service designers in the room, because I think for some time service design has been positioned as a way to dematerialize our economy, but it's complex as well. Because when we look at it very closely, we see that this shift to services hasn't actually delivered many improvements when it comes to the resource intensity of rich nations. So according to the World Bank data, global services have grown to 69% by 2015, yet during that time, the global material reuse has also accelerated. So Jason Hickles has said that actually what we're seeing is a rematerialization of the global economy, even as we have shifted to services. And so another example, another critical example going back to Apple and closing the loop here, is the recent Mother Earth video, which you might have seen, which celebrates the carbon neutral product. While I think it's definitely a step into the right direction because it addresses things like carbon neutrality in product design, I also equally think it falls short of addressing sustainability more holistically, especially in terms of social and governance aspects in the supply chain I just outlined earlier. So I think critics might argue that the absence of very clear commitments to combat these inequalities within the supply chain actually indicates a somewhat lingering reliance on an extractive business model still. So ultimately not really changing the foundations of the economic model. So I think Apple is actually an example of how design is still contributing to the spread of an extractive and very much growth-focused business practice, because the message even in their ad is not to buy less, but to continue buying more, but just do it in a more carbon neutral way. So Escobar has pointed out that our environmental and social issues persist because our systems and products are often confined by the constraints of our prevailing economic model, which shape many, many of our design decisions. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that many of our current environmental and social challenges can at least in part be attributed to a failure of design. However, there is an emerging consensus within the design community that design must evolve from being driven by a growth-focused economic model to one that's a lot more relational and regenerative, and that can foster a more sustainable and equitable future. And this change means moving away from our current economic system focused on extracting value through commodification and challenging our fundamental mindsets and practices from extractive to regenerative, from a mindset of control and predict to sensing and responding, from seeing humans as superior to actually embracing multi-species and non-human, from an exploitation of resources to embracing a systems living view, from living in a world of climate system breakdown to one that actually nurtures nature's wisdom and the logic of life, and from a world based on inequality and often, unfortunately, racism to one that's a lot more about diversity and equality. And at a more systemic level, scientists have argued for much needed shift from a fragmented to a whole system model as well, which of course has been described as a significant cultural leap, almost a paradigm change that we need to make through reframing design processes to understand how the systems of life actually work in each unique place. So starting here from Bill's read diagram that some of you might have seen before, starting from a conventional design practice to one that's green, aiming to be green and sustainable, like some of the examples I've shown, which still focus at not doing any more additional harm, but recognizing that in the context of the planetary boundaries that we're in, that's no longer enough. And we really need to move beyond that towards embracing completely different, more regenerative practices, where we see us humans being part of nature again. And so more and more scholars have been calling for the need to redesign design, where design becomes and welcomes more plural ways of knowing and designing with many, and truly focuses on being relational by design. Now, in my research, the Berkana theory of change was really helpful for me to position myself and my design practice within that. And I think it provides a valuable framework for visualizing the shift from a dominant system that uses the old paradigm to an emerging one that is embedded in a new paradigm. Importantly here, I think to recognize is that these systems potentially never really meet directly, but there is an active transition phase between them. And as such, I think it's a really helpful tool as a self-reflection for us in design practice to understand, well, where our position within that is and comprehend our own roles that we might need to take on moving forward. So with that in mind, another quick reflective question to you is, before we move on to the next part, to reflect on where you might see your own practice, whether that's in research or in design practice, positioned at the moment within this Berkana model of change, in the dominant or in the emerging system, or are you already transitioning and are considering what your role could be? So again, please, I'll just be quiet for a minute and share some thoughts, some comments you might have relating to that before we move on to the last part. I'm just reading some of the comments. So thank you so much for sharing. I'd like to be composting things. Me too. And Katharina said, no, I lost your comment. I want to be part of the emerging system, and I'm aware I'm deeply stuck in the dominant paradigms. Yes, to that as well. Okay, then let's move on to the final part, where I'm going to share a little bit of my PhD research with you. So I think that to some of these big challenges, there are different narratives that are already currently emerging in response, which, being a designer by background myself, really excite me again. I feel like the early days of service design, where actually we can experiment and play a little bit. So designers in the regenerative space are collectively shaping new stories, offering a more pluralistic perspective and approaches on what this relationality actually might look like. So for the remainder of our time now, in terms of my contribution to it, I'd like to present you with one pathway that I've been researching in my PhD, which is the commons. So what are the commons? The commons can be understood as a deeply collaborative arrangement for value production. Now that sounds as quite a mouthful. That are based on a set of participatory principles. They usually traditionally refer to shared resources, often natural resources, that are collectively managed and governed by a community or group of people. And they really emphasize relationships and interconnections through caring infrastructures. Now, there's a so-called economic theory of the commons, which is mostly attributed to the Nobel Prize-winning economist Elinor Ostrom, who through extensive empirical research found that the commons, traditionally meadows, farmlands, or oceans, involve relationship and community as a form of living organization. And that this living organization, in fact, emerges based on a set of cooperative behaviors that she summarized as a set of core design principles, which you can see on the screen here. So I'm going to summarize the principles quickly. There's quite a bit of text there. So the first one is about clear boundaries, allowing groups and communities to define shared identities and goals. The second one is about proportional equivalence. So to balance benefits you get from the resource and from the system with cost and contributions, and agree rules of collaboration as well. The third one is about collective choice, letting system actors participate in the rulemaking. So the basic idea behind it is that if I'm affected by a decision, I should be part of that decision-making process. Then the fourth one is monitoring, keeping an eye on resource use and agreed rules. The sixth one, I think, is conflict, is graduated sanctions, understanding and acting when agreed rules are actually broken. So what if somebody doesn't actually follow the rules? There needs to be some counter behavior to actually show that person. Then there's conflict resolution. When things actually go fundamentally wrong, you need to have ways to resolve disputes. Then the seventh one is a minimal recognition of rights to organize. Groups need to allow for agency and self-organization in terms of how they're being organized. And then the last one is called nested enterprises, organizing, which is about organizing and always contextualizing yourself and your group and your endeavor in the context of multi-level systems. So to never let go of the bigger holistic picture. To give you some examples of the commons, so they include traditional resource-based commons such as communal tenures that have lasted over centuries. An example here that Ostrom has researched herself extensively are the high mountain meadows in Switzerland, in Terbe, where Ostrom actually learned how the local community has successfully managed the region's historic irrigation channel since the 15th century. So they have a natural resource and they've actually managed to organize themselves in a way that everybody could have access to it without overly extracting from it. And that very governance structure that this community actually had set up operated on the basis of those principles that I just shared with you. Now, since Ostrom's research, there's been a lot more research being done on the idea of commons, and scientists have found that there's not just material or natural commons, but also different types of commons, immaterial commons. And here's one that I want to talk to you about, which is called Buurtzorg. Some of you might know. It's a home care organization based in the Netherlands that very much focuses on creating very small self-guided teams of highly trained nurses who serve a number of patients in their same neighborhood. The core of Buurtzorg, however, is that they're designing out any bureaucracy and actually making that caring relationship very direct. So they're operating on the very principles, again, that Ostrom outlined of, first of all, getting people together to agree on shared purpose, allowing their teams to self-organize, not have hierarchy involved, and allowing for collective decision-making between patients and caregivers, as far as even sometimes having neutral mediators coming in case that conflicts are arising. So they've thought about conflict resolution as well. Now, the commons-based principles come to life as teams actually have and live that shared purpose. Their services are democratically managed and inclusive of patients and caregivers. There's a holacratic management in place. And the organization distinguishes itself through decentralization, where self-managing nursing teams have the authority to make any patient care decisions, and therefore promoting collaboration over competition with a very patient-centric paradigm. Another very different example of a commons is WikiHouse, which you might have come across as well, which is a community library of free designs for building very inexpensive modular housing. And that's very much an example of what they call it themselves, a mass collaborative design project. So again, it's connected by a common set of principles, and they created an organization that makes all designs available under the Creative Commons license. So WikiHouse is a type of digital commons and relies on the idea of peer projection that shows again a very striking resemblance to Ostrom's principles if you analyze it. It enables communities to collectively design and construct those sustainable, adaptable, and very affordable housing solutions. So what sets commons apart from private property or government interventions is that they are typically governed based on these principles of cooperation, of mutual benefit and sustainability, rather than private ownership and exclusive control. And the point I wanted to make is that they can take various forms, including natural commons, which is what Ostrom's was mainly researched. But now they are also knowledge commons. Wikipedia is another one, so sharing knowledge, information, and cultural creations. There's urban commons, such as public spaces, community gardens, or shared transportation systems. And then there are digital commons, like the WikiHouse one, or healthcare commons, like the Bertzel case I just talked to you about. And what I found really interesting to come across in my research is that scientists have now discovered a connection between the economic theory of the commons and evolutionary theory of cooperation. So contrary to the common belief that species and organisms, including ourselves, act always in their self-interest to maximize their own success, and because of that, we would be extracting more and more from Earth in order to actually feed our own self-interest. In fact, research has shown that species and us as humans often exhibit very high levels of cooperation. And they found that these key principles that underlie this evolutionary cooperation mechanism align again very closely with Elinor Ostrom's core design principles. And this connection and this insight has led scientists to propose that perhaps by understanding the commons, it can help us to understand how cooperation can emerge and be sustained amongst individuals, particularly in situations that involve shared resources. So the focus has actually shifted from the commons as an end product, as an end solution, if you like, to commoning, describing the practices of sustainable collaboration as a form of self-organized and decentralized management, if you like. And so we often speak about processes of commoning now that allow groups to effectively work together while creating the rules for sustainable use of common resources, whether they're material commons or immaterial commons. And the point I wanted to make is that the commons, despite all the challenges that we are facing, are not some vague utopian ideology, but they are actual projects that are amongst us. They're already happening. They're very much in line with the idea of degrowth, and they've been around us for centuries as well. But my question in my research was, well, do we actually actively design for these? Looking at our very widely distributed design processes, are the comments and the insights and the learnings we can actually take from them and from the core principles of commoning, are they anywhere reflected in our design process? Well, I don't think so. I think our current design process helps us to define an outcome. You see the updated design council double diamond here. At the end is still the outcome, and I think we've got a very good process that helps us to get from A to B to define what the outcome is. But actually, it doesn't really help us to ensure that this outcome is sustainable in the first place or equitable, nor that it can be sustained in the long run. And I think this is where commoning principles could help us in design. So in my PhD thesis, I developed an interest in exploring the potential of commons principles as a design heuristic to guide future design practice towards a more relational framework that prioritizes planet centricity and really shifts away from a more extractive, human-centered perspective, especially during the early stages of the design process. So it's about conceptualizing the commons as a way to reevaluate contemporary design practice towards planetary health. And while much of Ostrom's research on the commons involved a more retrospective analysis, extracting these commoning design principles from all these different initiatives that she's researched, my focus was on using these principles as a more creative lens to facilitate the design of more collaborative and regenerative infrastructures from the outset. So I want to share three aspects of my research before I finish today. Some key activities that I want to touch upon. First, I dived into a theoretical exploration of applying the commoning practices to foster cooperation among system actors with a focus on a marine protected area in the South African Ocean to improve government frameworks. So a result was a co-authored paper, and we did a conceptual exploration of whether or not actually we could use the commoning principles to improve some management practices that have been documented to be failing. Then second, I undertook co-creation efforts to test and co-design how these commoning principles could inform contemporary design practice, which resulted in a set of very practical commoning questions and activities that designers might be able to take up. But then I still hadn't tested it in practice, so I conducted an extensive ethnographic research working with a case study organization to reinterpret Ostrom's foundational design principles in the context of organizational service design. And that resulted in the development of what I'm referring to as a commoning compass, which is a guiding framework for relational and planet-centric practice, which I will also discuss in detail in my forthcoming thesis, which I'm still finishing up. So the first part, the conceptual exploration. In there, to give you a bit more of an idea of what I've done, we focused on the Tsitsikamma National Park marine protected area in South Africa. Some of my colleagues were from South Africa, and hence we focused on that, which is well known for its very absolutely ineffective governance model. So the MPA is the oldest one in South Africa. It was created in 1964 under the apartheid regime, but it disregarded local communities' rights to the coast, and in some cases even removing or restricting access to the ocean altogether, which had incredible impact on their livelihoods. So our aim was to conceptually apply commoning design principles to potentially improve the situation, to test whether actually that current governance model could be improved by design. And our analysis revealed, one, that there was a complete lack of commoning principles in the current practices. None of the 8 principles were shown or were evident in their current ways of managing the MPA. And so to address this, we then explored an alternative vision aligning with Ostrom's principles instead. So we conducted a deep collaborative mapping exercise to identify economic needs from the ocean, from a human perspective, collective interests from organizations. There's tourism organizations, for instance, as well, but also non-human interests, goals, and motivations from natural ecology actors. And this exercise showed straight away the importance of understanding all of these perspectives in order to actually be able to even negotiate and establish a shared sustainable purpose. So one of our key findings there was that applying commoning principles very much encouraged the representation of the non-human voice, something that's been entirely disregarded previously. And it emphasized the need to actively address those tensions and potential conflicts that inevitably arise among all of these different system actors. So at least you needed to consider them, you needed to bring them all out on the table, and you needed to find some space to discuss them. So an important insight derived from the conceptual exploration was that commoning could actually help to decenter human perspectives within the design process. And although we had created some quick exercises to explore each of Ostrom's principles, a real challenge that we faced was that there was a real absence of assigned tools or activities in Ostrom's work. So there isn't, if you like, a playbook that tells you how to apply those principles in practice. And we soon realized that, and it made it quite difficult to effectively apply the principles in practical contexts. So in my PhD then, I went on into a scoping research phase where I concentrated on finding more practical ways to implement these principles. So from the paper I created then a set of commoning starter questions based on the 8 principles that we designers could use for ideation and self-reflection in our current practices. And I then facilitated a series of co-creation workshops with some systemic service and social designers with the aim to enable them to critically assess their existing working methods through a commoning lens. So I ran 3 co-creation workshops and tested whether these commoning principles could actually help to identify design practice gaps, which they successfully did, across 3 key clusters: 1, information gaps, a series of imagination gaps, and governance infrastructure gaps as well. And this testing also then allowed me to refine the commoning questions to simplify their language and make them a lot more accessible, because I kept learning that the language that Ostrom is using feels really hard to understand, especially in an organizational and design context. So this resulted in 80+ ideas, which I then synthesized down to 60 concepts for potential commoning activities. And a key finding from the scoping co-creation was that commoning alongside the starter questions could be a really helpful lens to help us re-question and redesign design. It really helps us to unveil a series of practice and knowledge gaps and helps us pinpoint towards some activities that could address them. It also highlights the need to adapt existing tools and techniques and what we used to use for a more planet-centric approach and how we might need to tweak them. So while actually numerous new concepts came out, the practical implementation still remained unclear to me. And this is when I moved into empirical ethnographic case study research, which lasted over 1.5 years. And I continued to test out these concepts within an organizational service design context in detail. And so through my own empirical research with the case study side, I ended up reinterpreting Elinor Ostrom's foundational principles, as the original language felt really alienating to the business context and the design context, and really hard to understand. I also dropped the numbers that Ostrom had assigned. She had numbers 1 to 8 because it implied a specific sequence to designers, and in practice they felt it was actually a lot more helpful to be able to move in between those principles depending on where their projects were strong or weak in. And also, instead of numbering them, 2 clusters had actually emerged. The first cluster, using a set of Ostrom's original principles, was a lot more around aligning the teams, agreeing on rules and behaviors, and actually creating alignment and a shared understanding. And then there was a second cluster underneath that, which was a lot more about enacting and turning these agreements into actions. And in some ways, in design, we already are quite strong, I think, in developing parts of that purpose principles in terms of developing visions and North Stars and so on. But we really lack in that enactment phase to actually anchor then what we previously agreed upon into practice, and often it gets lost. So this is what I found over the year and a half. And then I reframed these principles using the metaphor of a compass to transform them into directional points. So not a prescriptive new framework, but actually just a compass that perhaps could be used by designers at the beginning or throughout our projects to actually remind us of these principles and whether or not we are actually incorporating elements of them in our practice. So they could potentially act as reminders for us of the importance of identifying shared purpose, nurturing relationships, balancing interests, empowering agency, making collective decisions, agreeing on behaviors, also establishing accountabilities and embracing differences to preempt the idea of conflicts. So building on these initial concepts, I then conducted a repeat co-creation session with my case study site as well, which resulted in a final set of concepts for commoning activities, which I'm currently designing as a set of cards. So you can see here the 8 principles being refined or redefined in their language. And then on the right, you can see just a few of the more detailed commoning activities. And then I also continue to test these concepts with my case studies to create a set of commoning resources through templates and ways of actually delivering these commoning activities in practice to also understand the potential impact that they would create. So the key insight from my empirical research revealed that commoning could be helpful for establishing collaboration infrastructures that we urgently need, which can support sustainability and foster trust and purpose within and across teams. However, it also created an awareness in people for the need to redesign those very fundamental economic structures within organizations. So the principles brought that out through discussions. So going back to the first parts of the presentation, which of course in an organizational context often hinge on the distribution of power within an organization. So I was working at a VP level, so quite high up in the organization already. And yet these very fundamental economic structural questions could not be truly addressed. So this then led me to reflect on the need to potentially implement a commoning approach on multiple levels, ranging from a project level to team dynamics, all the way up to very senior leadership, to actually impact the change that I think we urgently need. So in the context of the project delivery, I found that commoning principles can really foster shared responsibility among team members and infuse a non-human multi-species lens into the design process. At the team level, it helped to enhance trust and help to create a sense of belonging. And then there's the context, of course, of designing new commons, which I was originally interested in, where I still believe that commoning could offer a framework, a really valuable framework too. However, I haven't been able to test commoning in this context in my research, but I think this area holds promise for future research to really understand if it could be used to design sustainable, equitable, and collaborative business and provisioning systems from scratch. And I think going back myself to the Berkana model of change, it's because in my research, I've been positioning myself in the dominant system, and I've been trying to help a large-scale organization to move on that transitional pathway, when actually my real interest is also to be working in this emerging system and to use it in the context of designing new commons. But future research ahead. So to finish, and leave a bit of about 15 minutes now of time for discussion, I'd like to invite you to draw some inspiration from Donella Meadows' view on dancing with systems. I believe after my research that the commons can really teach us about the aliveness of systems based on everyday interactions between people and resources. And the thing is, the commons are already here, and so are early versions of commoning practices. It's not necessarily something we need to design from scratch. So as such, I think it would be time for designers to embrace some key learnings we can take from the commons as a means to dance and relate with systems in a different way. So thank you very much for listening, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Julia. A great presentation. And I do think, and I do hope that there are a lot of reflections and questions out there in the audience. So maybe while you're thinking about what you want to talk about or what you want to ask, we can look a little bit at the chat. I don't know if Jennifer Tong is still in the meeting. I hope so, because she wrote something that we have an increased focus on system innovation in the public sector rather than innovating of new services and products. And Susanna, you are from a municipality in southern part of Sweden. Would you like to maybe tell us a little more about how you done that transition in that municipality? Is that possible, Jennifer?
I would say we're still at the very beginning of that journey. I think it's more of this. And that's just my opinion, but I think that there's a recognition that while we've been focusing I've been working in this municipality for 5 years now. We've been very focused on like, how can we come up with new solutions and better services, and maybe trying to even push ourselves to think like, are the problems we're working with, are they going to be relevant in 5 years or not? To sort of up our game there with public services. But I think now that we've made a commitment to how we want to work with the climate, then there's been this realization, mainly from the team that's working with innovation, that it requires a much more systemic view of the issues. And I think that's where we're at right now, is that this recognition. And what does that mean then? To reorganize how we work across the different departments and with external actors as well. What does that mean to collaborate? What does that mean to identify the actual problems collaboratively? It's just this wealth and overwhelming flow of challenges that we're just at the beginning of, like, trying to understand what would that mean to really change how we work. And I liked what you commented on, Kala, that it's also very much a political question, and I don't have any answers to that. When we bump up against whether there's the political will to actually make those changes is another layer of complexity. So I think what you said, Julia, about like how there should be different levels, like how do you approach this at different levels is really relevant. I don't know. Do you have any interesting comments for that?
No, well, I hear you, and I think as you start out on these challenges, there's only more complexity to be revealed. And to me, my mind went back to this idea of the sort of relational element of that, understanding, and in my research as well, I looked at this network side, what used to be the 8th principle, and it's to understand the context, and it's really deeply overwhelming. One of the things that I've done through the research then to understand what a commoning activity in that field would be is to actually look and really try to figure out what ecosystem mapping is all about. There's quite a few approaches and lots of talk about ecosystem mapping, and I've been looking at Ostrom and her framework of how she would have approached it to try and get a bit more of a glimpse on what this big picture is about, what all of these different system actors, system parts that you're dealing with are actually there. I think it does still help to try and get your head around that level of complexity first, and then absolutely use a layered approach to that as well. But just even taking the space to be understanding it in that way, I think is still quite new to us, because I think often we just jump really quickly into a solutioning mode and not so much into understand what are the conditions we need to create to be creating the solutions first. So yeah, I don't have any answers, but just some thoughts and some, just resonance. It resonates what you said, and it's very complex.
Thank you. Is there anyone who wants to raise their hand? I have some kind of reflection or question to the group or directly, or should we take another one from the chat maybe? Our hands are up. A little bit shy today, but I think that I'm thinking about while you trying to raise your hands, I can think of this that you wrote here, Maria. Maybe you will tell us a little more about it. But you wrote, I'm trying to grasp where I will make the most differences, try and choose where to spend my time most effectively, expanding from human-centered to life-centered and work a systemic approach. Would you like to tell us a little more about that, maybe?
Yeah, I'm just thinking that it's important for me to do what I can to spend my time, whether it's personal time or working time, where I can make the most difference. And I'm trying to sort of understand where that is, whether it's in my local community or at work in different types of projects and I'm sort of trying to tag at all of those things, trying to figure out what difference am I making on these different levels. And I find it hard, like as I mentioned, I work as a consultant, and I'm sort of up against the system, I feel, where my employer sort of, you make money in the old paradigm or in that prevailing sort of paradigm, and how can you then try and push to go into that new like sort of new solutions, new types of solutions, and so I haven't figured. I'm sort of trying to understand, should I just sort of opt out of the old system entirely and try and do something on my own, or how can I try and tie the two together, try and bring more of the new into the old? So I'm still I'm trying to figure it out. I don't really know how to find the best place in the world to make the best difference. And I find that it's kind of a personal journey as well.
Maybe I can quickly comment on that. I feel we're in the same boat, so very much on a personal level as well. I absolutely hear you. I think what's been interesting from my research, maybe I can give you some insights there, because doing a lot of the first principle, the kind of purpose building work revealed a lot of these dilemmas that we as individuals we're in, but then we're stuck in an organization, and there's a real conflict there, because often the individuals I've worked with in this large corporate place, they all really wanted to instigate change. They're really passionate about it, but they feel like inherently stuck by, and bound by these old paradigms. And so I think we're all getting to that point of asking, where do I position myself, and also really sensing a real deep frustration around it if you can't actually accelerate the change that you want to see. One thing we did do, and it does kind of go back to these, unfortunately, to these incremental steps, but I think we still need them. But that gave people a glimpse of hope, was to actually look at and identify what they are already doing and where they're already having pockets of time. So for instance, a really simple example was a project kickoff. We have probably all of us some ways of when a new project kicks off, of how we would actually structure it, what questions we would address by different teams coming together. And so we actually redesigned the way that they were going to kick off this project by, bringing in different questions, allowing the team to spend the time that they had already allocated, but dealing with different things and actually tackling them from a slightly different angle. So instead of adding more to the workload, you know, to the long to-do list, we were really looking at, well, what do people already work on? What are they already spending their time on? And where are the system leverage points within that, where we can, you know, infuse new ways of doing, new ways of thinking about it. And that was helpful, and it's possible, you know. So yeah, it doesn't answer your bigger question around, you know, where to position yourself. We're all in that boat, but I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done within that dominant system as well, and lots to get onto. So I would encourage you to do that.
Thanks.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more reflection or comment, and I don't know, but I hope that Sophie's microphone is working, because I think that since we have a designer from the H&M organization, maybe we should let you in, because you wrote something here earlier in the chat that you would think about that H&M might be one of the worst industries when it comes to sustainability. We're doing deep organizational and systemic design work whilst also keeping the connection to less design maturity within the organization. And I was thinking, since Julia also had one of her slides with the H&M projects, maybe you will have some kind of reflection if your mic is working.
Sophie,
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Great, wonderful. Yeah, I find this so interesting. Thank you so much, Julia, for a great presentation and for the work that you're doing. It's so nice to get this kind of served as we are working with these incredibly important and big questions that are so difficult to kind of get when you're working in a very large organization that's strongly led by a very big and old culture of business, it's very important to have the right facts on your side, and also to know a little bit, I mean, for me, to get the outside perspective and to have the fuel from the outside is really important. As we all know, when we are working in large organizations, it's so important to get the outside perspective. I have a team of service designers and also UX researchers who are also working on a holistic level. And the design maturity in some parts of the organization is very high. On some parts, we are working with very strategic, systematic, and mindset shift questions. But we're also like a group of people that is incredibly small in regards to the company as a whole. So the work that we are doing, we need to be very strategic and very precise in where we direct our efforts. And we also always need to have an understanding of the business, because unless we show that we are understanding the business and we are catering for the business, but in the long term for a business that is, you know, proving itself every 3 months, right? So that is something that we continuously have to keep in mind, that we are catering for a business, and we need to understand the business in order for them to listen to us and to have the trust in that we want the best for the business. And we're just not coming to the business and saying that, you know, you are doing this wrong, you should do it another way. It doesn't work like that. We need to build the trust within the organization and also build our cases in order to build the wave where they are just understanding it. The same way as we're working with service designing large organization in healthcare or in IT companies or in any kind of industry that we are trying to make this shift in. So with that said, and also with what Jennifer was asking, like when you sit with these really large questions and you're like, oh my goodness, the work is so big. How are we going to get there? You know, it's really important to sit with that, but also to kind of like go up and get some air in order to sustain the glow and the fire that you have and the belief that it is possible, because you need to see the constant moving forward, that okay, oh, in this meeting I actually made a difference when it comes to the stakeholders that are important to make a future decision. So it can be meetings, it can be projects, it can be, because it's all in the everyday life that we are pitching the perspective, that we are sharing the knowledge, that we have the data that encourages us to make other small decisions that are not that hard for the company to make, right? Because if we start with the big decisions and the big changes, it's never going to work. We need to be with everything, like we need to cut the elephant in pieces in order to reach the whole elephant, right? So yeah. But then, and also on the case, H&M is doing a lot of initiatives when it comes to sustainability. So there are a lot of people around the organization who are working with this and who are very engaged in this question. But it is a very, very large organization. And I mean, the big questions are very difficult to actually work with.
Thank you, Sophie. Our time is running out, but maybe, yeah, sure. Thank you very much. But maybe you have some kind of, do you have some kind of last reflection on this, Julia, or what do you think about those things that Sophie were talking about this large organization?
I wish I had more time to chat, lots of thoughts. But yeah, I mean, I totally agree. And hence, you know, even in my research, that's why things went right back to the more incremental aspect, I would call it, which frustrates me because you don't get to answer these big questions. You don't get to shift them. And there's huge uncertainty, or the big questions around whether you can ever shift a shareholder-led company to start with. You know, Patagonia is always a great example mentioned in that space, but they were privately owned. So does that mean that you need to have a certain ownership structure in place before you could actually tackle these bigger economic issues, you know? And yeah, I mean, lots of unknowns. I think, I don't know, just my last reflection is that this is just a personal thing. Why I like to bring the Bekana model of change in, because I think it helps me feel okay with the place I'm in, you know, seeing the bigger systemic change, and that it's not one system moving into the other. They're two succinct places and there's different roles to be played. And Kalle, you said, you know, you'd like to be composting, and we don't compost anything at the moment, you know. So I think this might be a good starting point to actually say, okay, an acknowledgement, our organization is in that place and it's only that far that we can get. And here's a couple of roles and places where we can actually start. And just one quick example, I don't know if we've got time for my case study side, but one of the things, again, through ecosystem mapping, it's brought it all out. What we've done is to basically I've gone in and tried to map a series of challenges related to that field. And they did broadly map into information challenges, imagination challenges, and governance challenges, to then actually understand, well, which are the ones where the team could have the most impact on right now, today. And one of the things was around KPIs, sustainability KPIs, for instance. And that's huge for a big organization, because they've got fabulous, great sustainability teams, but they don't trickle down into all the relevant places, especially relating to sales. And in fact, the KPI structures are often conflicting. They're completely conflicting, and they're incentivizing the wrong actions, you know. So it helps, I think, getting that systemic overview helps you to actually pinpoint some places where you can start that you could have more impact in than others. So